The era of civil rights is from the 1950s to the 1970s, right? Actually, 1 out of every 3 Native Americans suffers from discrimination in the workplace. 38 to 63% of Native Americans live below the federal poverty line. The
Indigenous people of America have faced depression throughout their history. Forced to travel thousands of miles to be crammed into reservations, their villages burned, their children purposely infected with disease. Native Americans have been constantly misrepresented, as have been their culture and traditions. Even today, as many as 33% of Indigenous people have reported discrimination everywhere, seeking healthcare, education, or fair pay.
About a third of Native Americans say they've experienced discrimination when they seek jobs, try for promotions, or earn equal pay. That's according to a new poll by NPR, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Harvard G.H. Chan School of Public Health. Some tribes are trying to combat that discrimination by creating their own jobs. Graham Lee Brewer reports.
When he started working as a bartender a few years ago in Seattle, Howie Echohawk says he began experiencing discrimination. First, a bar manager told him to get a respectable haircut.
I had a mohawk, which is like the traditional style of my people, and I wore it because of that.
Echohawk is a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, so he cut his hair. Then, a few months later, he broke his ankle and had to take some time off.
When I finally came back to work, one of the managers there told me that's what happens when you Indians get your fire water. And so I filed a complaint very quickly and basically put in my 2 weeks notice.
Still in Seattle, Echohawk says racial misconceptions followed him to his first communications job. His company launched an advertising campaign using Indigenous peoples in it. Echohawk says those images have been widely criticized by Native communities because they posed Indigenous peoples in colorful outfits that didn't accurately represent their culture or heritage.
It was not good, and I was pretty livid, actually.
Echohawk met with his bosses several times, and they offered a compromise, but it left a sour taste in his mouth.
As a democratic country, America loves to advertise the fact that all citizens can vote. Ironically, some Native Americans, the original Americans, were denied voting rights until the 1960s. Recently, Indigenous people have not been voting, or have been voting in unintended ways because language translation has not been provided. The state of Alaska refused to comply with translation requirements. Then the Native Americans Rights Fund stepped in. They provide both oral and written translation resources for Native Americans in their original language. In fact, the Native American Rights Fund, or NARF, provides legal support for tribes and individuals. The NARF uses legal influence to protect human rights of Native Americans. Some cases done include the Indian Child Welfare Act, protecting voting rights, as well as promoting Native American human rights in general. The NARF has helped oppressed Native Americans gain back some of their cultural and constitutional rights. The NARF works with the U.S. Department of Education, Congress, and other government groups to bring justice to Indigenous people. For instance, the NARF worked with the Department of Education to fund the Tribal Education Department's National Assembly, or TEDNA, and strengthen tribal governance in order to help protect Natives and their right to govern education. Before the TEDNA, all Indigenous children were forced to go to strict government boarding schools, where they faced racial slurs and other discrimination. The boarding schools were far away from the children's homes on reservations, and therefore they were separated from their family for long periods of time. After the NARF's involvement, members of the tribe were directly involved in governing education. The education now highlights Native American culture and accomplishments. Furthermore, aside from being denied governing education rights, Native American children were being taken away by state agencies and courts from their homes to be placed in non-Native foster or adoption homes. This was due to the misunderstanding of tribal cultures and societies. Being removed from their tribes led to broken families, loss of culture, identity problems, arrest, and even suicide. The NARF helped establish welfare protection laws and has given support to several Indian Child Welfare Act cases, like the case of Simons versus Parks. This case revolves around Mr. Parks and Ms. Stearman having their parental rights terminated and their child's being granted permanent custody to the Simmons. Mr. Parks then sued the state court, claiming that the tribal court has no jurisdiction over him and that his right to due process was violated when the court didn't permit Mr. Parks' attorney to present oral argument. Mr. Parks claimed the court order was not entitled to full faith and credit under the Indian Child Welfare Act. The state court dismissed the action. This whole process led to the Alaska Supreme Court issuing Order 1784, creating the new Child in Need of Aid (CINA) court rules, which address registration and confirmation of tribal court orders in child custody proceedings. NARF will continue to educate tribes about these new rules and the court's ruling. Overall, the Native American Rights Fund has preserved Native American culture and helped them on their journey to equality.